Hello there, listeners of the Bylines Network podcast. Welcome to another brand new episode of the Bylines Network Reports series. This week, Ben Dickenson, our managing director, and Patricia Paton of Byline Scotland fame are interviewing George Monbiot, who was previously on a talk of this very series, offering further discussion about how Britain's doing, the ousting of the left of the Labour Party, and what real reform means to the country. I hope you enjoy.
Welcome to this special Bylines Network Reports podcast. Myself, Ben Dickenson here, Managing Director of Bylines Network, Patricia S, who leads our publication in Scotland. And we're delighted to have the esteemed George Monbiot with us. As George showed us during our Hope Against Hate roundtable recently, titled Can Citizens and Journalists Work Together to Reclaim Democracy? He's got a very strong grasp of the way capital works and its resistance to democracy over the long period of time. But so let's dive in with an immediate thing. We're sitting here on the afternoon of Rachel Reeves' budget announcement. We haven't had time to digest that yet. Some of the headlines I've seen, though, are there's a new taxes on gambling. There are some relief on taxes on business that we know. We know there's about 23 million, which seems like nothing. Investment for schools, some of that for libraries in schools. There seems to be a further 4.9 billion efficiency saving proposed for the NHS. And there's also, particularly relevant today, the freezing of duty on fuel and proposals to cut red tape so that nuclear power can be expanded. And without commenting necessarily on the budget, without having seen the detail of it yet, I'm just interested. Those things feel very consistent with this government and actually previous governments of other colours, actually, in terms of kind of fiscal policy. And so I'm interested, what's the direction of travel and how successful is it likely to be, particularly in ecological terms, of those kinds of policies that we're seeing right now?
Well, there's two primary characteristics of this government, which I believe are essential to understanding it. The first is a visceral, deep hatred of the Labour left. And this is a very major motivating factor within Keir Starmer's government. And what that means, and it's like carrying a huge sack of rocks on their back because it's this sort of burden of hatred and disgust that they bear towards anyone to the left of Vlad the Impaler. And what it means is that if they introduce any progressive policy, it looks like a concession to the left. And they would far rather make concessions to the right of them, to Conservatives, to Reform, than they would to the Labour left. And it's this crazy position they've got themselves in, where the faction which brought Starmer into the leadership of the Labour Party, Morgan, McSweeney and all their bunch, their whole MO was, we are not Corbyn, we are not the left of the Labour Party, we must purge the left from the Labour Party. And that means that they now have an incredibly limited worldview and within their own minds, an incredibly limited set of options. So they can't deliver so many of the things which we desperately want. But then they don't want to either, because the second factor explaining this government is an extraordinary susceptibility to lobbyists. And if you've got a lobbyist from a capital-based position, in other words, either an industry or representing an oligarch or a billionaire, then they are all ears. They'll say, yes, well, tell us exactly what you want and we'll deliver it for you. So if you look, for instance, at something I've become very animated by, which is the Planning and Infrastructure Bill, which has now gone through Parliament, which rips away a huge tranche of crucial environmental protections for which our political and environmental ancestors have fought very hard to secure. And it just sweeps so many of them away and basically says any developer, whether it's a house builder or someone building a road or building a power station, whatever it might be, they no longer have to bother with all that protecting green spaces, protecting nature reserves, protecting beautiful and precious places. They can just pay into a fund instead to make up for any damage they do, and somewhere someone will create some habitat to replace it. which, A, a lot of this is irreplaceable, and B, great, you lose your local park, but someone in another county might get a park. That's really going to cheer you up, isn't it? So you how did this come about? It came about because Labour have flatly refused to talk to the ecologists, the experts in the field. They haven't done a proper consultation on it, but instead they've been absolutely enmeshed with the house building industry and the other big development corporations, who, instead of accepting the structural reasons why we don't have the homes and other things we need, such as the failure to build council homes and sell off of the council homes as well, the extreme control by 6 house building companies, which have pretty well mopped up the entire sector and sit on their land banks, just wanting the value of the property to rise, because you can't lose that way, rather than releasing houses onto the market, which could bring down the price. A whole load of fiscal incentives, which have perversely raised the price of housing. All of those things. Instead of attending to those, they say, oh yeah, what's to blame? Wildlife. It's because of the bats and newts and spiders and snails that you don't have a home. It's actually got absolutely nothing to do with wildlife. This is pure scapegoating. And incidentally, the only species they mention are ones that you would find in a witch's cauldron: bats, newts, spiders and snails. They never say dormice and otters and nightingales and butterflies and orchids, because people might like those. And so, and people might think, oh, I'd rather want to protect those. So and this policy, Rachel Reeves, she said the quiet bit out loud. She said this policy was hatched at a smoked salmon and scrambled egg breakfast with corporate lobbyists. And Keir Starmer also, in his article in the Times, said we did this as a result of listening to leading CEOs. So what we have here is it's a government just coming straight out and saying, we're giving these commercial lobbyists what they want, and the rest of you can go to hell, because there's a direct payoff between what the country needs and what capital demands, and they've chosen their side, and it's capital. So this is the two factors: the hatred of the Labour left and the extreme obsequiousness towards corporate and oligarchic lobbyists, grovelling to capital. You put those two things together, and what you end up with is a government which will act against our interests. It cannot meet our needs. It is constitutionally locked out of the possibility of meeting our needs.
Your next question, Patrick, kind of touches on a slightly sideways area of that, but it's really quite interesting because part of the picture as well is, of course, having a devolved democratic structure, or partially devolved. I'm sure we could debate the success or not of devolution around the country and the impacts of that. And one of those things in it seems to be coming out of this budget is a prizing of nuclear power. And I know there are strong feelings about that in Scotland, aren't there, Patchy? So
yes, the nuclear expansions are a quite divided subject on Scotland, and it can cause an uproar. So what I think is, what would you have to say to the citizens in Scotland who feel their voices aren't heard in Westminster? Mainly if you take into account that the Scottish government has maintained a policy against new nuclear power stations. So how do we stay on that?
Yes, so the whole thrust of devolution has been, we might hand you down some of the powers which have been concentrated in Westminster, and aren't we kind to give you a bit of this and a bit of that, and there'll be some reserved powers, and there'll be some things that you're allowed to do, that is what devolution is, but it's not what a transfer of power means. A genuine transfer of power means an active effort to build power up from the bottom upwards, rather than something which is handed down from the top, and then you might have a sort of waterfall trickle down effect of power going down, and maybe one day someone at the very bottom will feel a tiny little drop of power landing on their head, and that, to me, is the exact wrong way round for a political system to function. Power is something that should be delegated upwards. That the fundamental unit of power should be communities, whether it's boroughs in a town, whether it's villages, small towns, whatever it might be, who are the driving force of politics. So I see participatory, deliberative politics as being absolutely crucial. And as you'll know very well, Patsy, coming from Brazil, there's this tremendous example in Porto Alegre in southern Brazil of a city which for 15 years was subject to participatory budgeting, where the job of setting the budget was not done by a Rachel Reeves type character, keeping it all secret and then saying, right, we're going to give you this and we're going to take this from you and here are our big decisions. Instead, you get the whole population together once a year, or as many people as want to participate, who decide how the money is going to be spent. And it had, as you know, a transformative effect on Porto Alegre. This was a brilliant innovation by the Partido dos Trabalhadores, the PT in Brazil, who decided that, it has to be done differently after so much corruption and clientelism and mafia politics in cities like Porto Alegre, and produced this incredible example of how the people can take charge of the political system. And we're constantly told, the people are useless. What do the people know? The people are ignorant. I mean, in Porto Alegre, many of the people were illiterate. How can they possibly make sensible decisions? And what we find time and time again with participatory democracy is that the people tend to make much better decisions than the supposed representatives do.
And they do start paying attention more and learning.
Exactly. And so we had, and what was created in Porto Alegre and in other places where similar things have been done, in Taiwan with the V-Taiwan program, in Seoul, in Reykjavik, Madrid, Barcelona, Paris to a smaller extent. What has happened in these places is that people become democratic citizens. Instead of consumers of politics, we become creators of politics. And politics for us is a living, breathing proposition rather than something we just sit and wait to land on our heads. And if government was really committed to the idea of the distribution of power, which is what devolution is meant to be, but of course isn't really at all, then it would be all about creating space for that participatory politics to start to grow. And the representative systems would still be there. I'm not saying, I don't go as far as Murray Bookchin and saying we get rid of representation altogether and we just have participatory politics. The representative systems would be sort of further down the line from the participatory systems. So we delegate to them powers. We say to them, right, we want you to do this. And there's some brilliant, innovative ways of creating a sort of a voice of the citizen where the sort of majority position is well represented and reflected, far more innovative and elegant than anything we do in this country, and pioneered in several parts of the world. And we can then engage in politics as a living, breathing proposition from day to day, from month to month, from year to year, rather than once every 5 years for 30 seconds. Which is currently the only political role we have. And then all the rest of that time, the intervening 5 years, government says, well, you voted for us. I mean, most of us say, no, we didn't. But okay, the 34% who voted for this government and gave it a huge majority, that 34% voted for us. Therefore, we can do whatever's in the manifesto, or we can ignore things in the manifesto, or we can do things which weren't in the manifesto as long as we get a majority in Parliament. So in other words, they presume our consent for everything they're going to do in this 5 years. And we don't accept the principle of presumed consent in sex. Why should we accept it in politics?
My question follow-up would have been, where's the example from, not that there is should be any issue with any of us taking an example from anywhere in the world. We're all human beings. Each country might evolve its society, but we're, hopefully one humanity. And where somebody has a model, we should borrow it. It's always been all of creativity is theft. Ultimately, every good idea is probably a stolen one. Why not steal from Brazil? We've stolen Patsy from Brazil, so we'll steal their idea. But I suppose I was thinking sometimes it's hard for people, and it's similar dynamic on the round table event that you joined the other week, that Hope Against Hate event. Sometimes you can feel very kind of atomized and isolated, and the further away that example feels, the more it feels other to you, even if it may not be, the harder it is to latch onto it. And I was wondering whether there is anything in this country that as a precedent, or even if it's not a democratic precedent, if it's within an organization or a network, dare I say, we have an element of that, a Bylines network, where as managing director, I'm regularly told what to do by the grassroots of the organization, and that's good. That's how it should be. But yeah, do we have a precedent in this country?
Well, there is something like that. For instance, we have some citizen assemblies.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
And when I was a member of the SNP, and I'm stressing here, I'm not anymore, we tried to put like science citizen assemblies.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Patrick. The problem is that these citizens' assemblies don't go anywhere because the government says they're not going to go anywhere. You know, It says, right, you can have your citizens' assembly and you can all sit down and come to a common position, and then you can fuck off. That is basically the government position.
Yeah.
Whereas, what you need is a structure which actually makes sense of what the Citizens' Assembly then does. So you look at Ireland, for instance, the Republic of Ireland, where they had citizens' assemblies on these huge issues, such as equal marriage legislation, legalization of abortion, and then those fed into a process which eventually, with a great deal of public discussion and engagement and sort of sensible and thoughtful commentary on these issues, then led to the referendums, which then led to the legalization of both those things in a country which very soon before had been basically a Catholic theocracy with the church controlling every aspect of life. And so we can see the transformative power there of participatory politics. But in this country, we seem determined to do everything wrong. So we might have a citizens' assembly, and Gordon Brown or someone will say, yes, this is a brilliant idea. Let's have a citizens' assembly. You have your citizens' assembly. You have people getting brilliantly engaged, brilliantly informed, people who've never really thought about these issues before, suddenly becoming experts in them through that process. And then you say, right, all go home and shut up. That's it. Thank you. Goodbye. And it's like, well, what was the point of that? Where does it lead? You've got to have the next step. Alternatively, looking at it the other way around, we can say, right, we're suddenly going to have a referendum. You're not going to know anything about the issue. It's going to be yes to this huge, complex and vast series of questions, or no to all of them. Yes to everything, no to everything, yes or no, in or out of Europe. And we saw this phenomenon of all these people the day after the referendum Googling what is the European Union. And there was no process of engagement, no process of public information. We were just sort of left to our own devices to grapple with this huge question, overwhelming question, in fact, too big for any one person to deal with, even if you're doing a PhD on it. Let alone if you like sort of come back from work and it's a Thursday and you think, oh God, I better quickly get down to the polling booth. What am I going to do? Yes or no? Yes or no? Yes or no to what? When we weren't even asked, if you want to leave, do you want to leave the whole thing, or do you want to leave the customs union or the single market or this political aspect of it? What is it we're being asked to do? And so, when we engage in something that looks like participatory politics in this country, we make a total nonsense of it, or rather, the governments make a total nonsense of it, whether they are Labour or Conservative, because they don't accept the idea of giving up any power. They don't accept the idea of the people having any power. And they have contempt for us. They don't respect the people they're supposed to represent. And I'm sure they believe, as many people do, that participatory politics, if it were allowed to happen, would be a total disaster. And a lot of people think that, but the people who think that are the people who know nothing about it. Because what we find is that participatory politics almost invariably works much better in practice than it does in theory. And that the people involved in it, ordinary citizens, tend to make better, greener, fairer, longer term decisions than elected representatives do.
And from all that you said, I keep asking this, mainly that I have a teenage daughter, is that we are in citizen journalism, and you are, as you said, we all have to get more involved in the aspects of politics, and we are not being allowed to. Mm-hmm. So what about the role that the schools play in the UK? Why secondary pupils are not engaged more in politics, at least the basics. I feel that they don't know much about it at all, unless they choose their specific subjects. So I keep putting in my mind, are schools augmenting the ignorance and helping populism indirectly?
I mean, I think you touch here on a really huge and crucially important issue, that the school curriculum is actually very poorly matched to preparing people for life beyond school. It teaches certain subjects, either teaching them well or teaching them badly, but it's not necessarily the subjects I would choose if I were thinking what will best equip people to survive in this tremendously complex and difficult place called the world, the social world, the physical world, the economic world that people are being thrust into. And we leave school with very few of the necessary skills. And one of those skills is clearly political skills. And it's great that, civics is now on the curriculum. People are being taught the rudiments of it, but really so little. And it's not so great the way the curriculum is structured. It's it could be much better, I feel. But also, I would like to see much more emphasis on emotional skills, on social skills. I mean, let's face it, these could be the only things left which AI doesn't steal from us. So if you want to be able to make a living, it could depend to a very large extent on your social skills. I just feel that, education is always fighting the last war. It's always equipping us with the skills we would have needed a generation or two earlier. And there's some aspects of it which still treat us as if we are part of some future Victorian industrial workforce.
It's interesting to say that, because I just thinking about that teenage son as well. It's interesting how much he learns from the kind of rabbit holes he goes down elsewhere. He and I were having a conversation about food, and he was like, I don't think I know where this comes from. I'm going to have a look. And he was trying to work out where the source of the food might be. So I was thinking there's a connection here between a question we wanted to ask you about, because you've been talking so much recently about global food systems and environmental footprint as one of the pathways to transforming stuff at scale and tackling both economic sustainability and world hunger. Is part of the answer in your systems analysis of food also about education, or is it much more structural, or do both things go in hand?
Well, it is both. And, it's not just that, the education is lacking. There's a sort of counter education in the school canteen. My daughter's school in many ways is good. They do a lot of good stuff, but you walk into the canteen and it's a wasteland. It's just really unhealthy, really bad food. It's straight out the back of some van which delivers these pre-prepared things. Of course, all the in-house catering is gone, and it's like, even if you're teaching children in class about healthy eating, what you're showing them in the canteen is extremely unhealthy eating and really bad eating habits. So it's just like, even if you were doing the right thing in the classroom, the disconnect is profound and disturbing. Same in hospital. We were visiting a friend in hospital, and on the ward door was this chart saying good food and bad food. And then the meal comes in, every single thing on her tray was on the bad food side. So there's that aspect. But you're absolutely right. People are incredibly ignorant about the environmental impacts and social impacts, political impacts of the food they eat. And we're kept in that way by a very vociferous food lobby, particularly the meat and livestock lobby, which has very successfully hidden from us the enormous environmental impacts of an animal-based diet. I mean, it's really huge. If you switch to a plant-based diet, and I don't want to sort of sound like I'm just going to bang this drum, but the science is very clear. If you switch to a plant-based diet, you reduce your land footprint by 75%, which is absolutely crucial. Land should be seen as the key environmental resource, because every hectare of land we use for our own purposes is a hectare which can't support wild ecosystems. Wild ecosystems are essential for most of the life forms on Earth, but they also sustain the Earth system itself. You also, switching to a plant-based diet, reduce your greenhouse gas footprint from your diet by about 75%. So you're dialing everything down to a quarter of what it was. And it's very hard to think of any other change we could make in our lives, which has even in the same ballpark of having such a big impact as a change in our diets. And yet, most people are completely unaware of this, and we're kept in that state of ignorance to a large extent deliberately, certainly by the media.
Yeah. I'm not going to mention much about making changes in our lives, mainly as a Brazilian that loves meat, but to be honest, I reduced a lot of meat. And it's interesting that you mentioned about land, and that we see some students, like primary school, learning how to plant vegetables or whatever in a small piece of land in the corner of the school. But then let's think now about land reform. Because UK are in the bottom 25% of nations for biodiversity and intactness.
Yeah.
Scotland's use of land is not efficient in terms of creating jobs. So a very few number, I think it's about 433, own half the land mass of Scotland. So even if someone with good intentions think of, let's plant some tomatoes, let's do good food around here, or so how can we make sure large landowners meet climate and nature targets? And how can governments, in this case, Scottish government, for instance, do more to encourage community ownership?
Yeah. Well, the first thing to say is that, Scotland isn't anywhere near where Scottish people would like it to be, but it's a lot nearer there than England is, where there's absolutely nothing. So in Scotland, you've got your community right to buy, you've got a universal right to roam. There's a lot more land access. Obviously, it becomes meaningful only if it's backed by significant amounts of money helping people to buy, because land prices have gone berserk. This takes us back to the first answer about, the house builders sitting on their land banks. Land has become a very valuable speculative commodity. It's the collateral you use for loans. There are many, many ways in which the value of land has pulled away from anything you might actually do on that land. And so there's a huge problem here. It's part of the rentier economy. The rentier economy is an economy which charges people for access to a service above and beyond the costs and profits of providing that service. So, the classic example is if you want to rent a home. Now, one of the things you're paying the landlord for the mortgage they might have, the costs of maintaining the place, any other service costs they might have, generally not very many, the gas check and things like that. But that doesn't explain the size of the rental payments you must make. What explains it is that they have an exclusive resource which you need to live. This is an essential thing, but it's in the hands of a small number of people. So in order to pass through the door, you need to pay a fee over and above anything that landlord has paid in terms of their costs, and over and above any reasonable profit which they might make from providing those services. And it's these entry fees, these sort of toll gate fees that you got to pay, which define a rentier economy. It's when economic interests control essential services or essential goods, and for people to obtain access to those, they have to pay that extra fee. And the same applies for so many issues. But with housing, 70% of the cost of housing is the cost of the land that it sits on, and the entry fee is bundled into the cost of the land. And so those who own the land, whether it's the big house builders or whether it's your big estate owners or whoever it might be, they have the rest of us over a barrel. So, not only do we need financial help if we're to make community right to buy in Scotland, which we might be getting in England, let's hope, and maybe in Wales as well, but not only do you need financial help to make that a real possibility that you can actually act on it, but we also need, much more intervention in this whole idea of land ownership We need something akin to land value taxation, to sort of widespread property taxes. We need direct intervention to make land more available to the people, to enhance our rights over the land and diminish the rights of this tiny number of people who claim to own it.
It's fascinating. I'm going to segue to a question I know Patrick's got in a second, but just a thought. I used to work and manage services in the supported housing and homeless sector. And in the late noughties, we got to the point where in some places we thought we might have got close to ending rough sleeping. Never going to fully get there, but we're close through certain interventions and funded schemes under the end of the last Labour administration, the Gordon Brown bit of it. And yet the figures have got considerably worse. Yeah. And so when you've actually got this, but it's a deep irony of the British housing economy that we have, it's roughly, if you add together all the rough sleeping figures where they are properly gathered, and those households in temporary accommodation across England, Wales and Scotland, it's about 380,000 households, which might be, if you count for kids and take shelters measurement, maybe 450,000 people, actual people, less than 500,000. We know how many empty homes there are in the country at the moment, 700,000. And that's not counting all of the secondary homes that some people own, or patches of land where there are buildings that could be used or brought into use. But it's precisely for the dynamic you talked about. And I can remember we were talking about this 20, 30 years ago in that sector. If only we could change the metric by which land is used, actually we could unlock that. And people wouldn't have to then go into a hostel as their next port of call. They could just have the keys to a home that is available to them and affordable. So it's the whole system is skewed against, not just against everyone, but particularly the most vulnerable are excluded from the opportunity to, and yet there's other people sitting on swathes of land making huge amounts of money out of it.
In 2019, I edited a report written with some very brilliant people called Land for the Many for the Labour Party, for Corbyn's Labour Party, which had, it was a sober report. We weren't going crazy, and we were sort of analysing exactly these problems and looking at some problems, some solutions which could be translated very easily into legislation. And we were being very careful. We're not here to hit the middle classes. We're here to change the structure of the system to make sure that it's fairer for everyone. And we deliberately avoided all sorts of pitfalls, which we could see where, we might be attacked by the billionaire press for this, because, we didn't want to cause any more problems for Corbyn's Labour Party than it was already facing. We published this report a few months before the election, and oh my God, I don't know why we bothered, because all the things we hadn't said, the newspapers claimed that we had said, and they just outright lied about it. And it was, I've often attracted a lot of controversy, and I've, had my fair share of being hated, but this was off the scale. It was a completely different level of just this vituperative, full spectrum attacks, and absolutely no sympathetic coverage outside the Guardian. BBC wouldn't touch it. No one would touch it in a way which actually represented what we were saying. The only coverage we got outside the Guardian was people absolutely slamming it, having made up stuff which they claimed that we were saying. And what you realise then is, oh my God, we have really hit a nerve here. This is what really counts for power. It's control of land.
I wonder, I was going to segue to Patrick's question, but actually there's another one that we had in our list for later on that I quite had to follow that, which is about journalism. And it's interesting because you're part of that fold, George. So those are your colleagues attacking you in many senses. And again, we talked about this on a round table the other week a little bit. And I was quite struck by how you, Nafeez Ahmed, Yasmin Al-Bahai-Brown, as journalists with profile, were so sharply critical of the rest of the journalism ecology. And I guess after the Leveson inquiry, we all have reasons to do that anyway that are very public because of some of the practices in journalism. But that was a discussion in context of the rise of the populist right and people's anxieties and fears about that and how they might reform. And you talked about some perspective and solutions on that there. How important, though, is it right now for journalism, plural, to be speaking truth to power? How do we get from the point where a report that's legitimate and credible, as you say, sober, like the one you did, isn't roundly attacked due to vested interest? And I guess for us, the obvious extension of that question is, what does citizen journalism bring to that party that others might not?
Yeah. So the fundamental problem is that the great majority of the media is owned by corporations or oligarchs. You have to have an awful lot of money to own a major media outlet, and their interests are diametrically opposed to the interests of society. This is one of the means by which capital seeks to defeat democracy. And that has been capital's aim ever since people began en masse to get the vote. How do we nip this in the bud? How do we stop this? Because everything that democracy demands is the opposite of what we want. People will want better wages, they'll want better health and safety and terms and conditions at work, they'll want more time off, but don't want to pay so much rent. They want clean air, they want clean water, they want good food, all of these things which cost us money and which reduce our profits. So we have somehow to put democracy back in its box. And the billionaire media is one of the most effective ways of doing that. So it's a huge problem. And it becomes even more of a problem when we look at the environmental crisis. If you were to ask me, which is the greatest threat to life on Earth, the fossil fuel industry or the media, I would say the media. And the reason for that is that the media gives the fossil fuel industry and all the other destructive industries their license to operate. It provides the arena in which they are still allowed to make their attacks on the common interests of humanity, because it's constantly justifying them and crushing dissenting voices and spinning the issue so that it looks as if we need them for our survival rather than the other way around. And so it is this huge and pressing threat to not just to humanity, but to all the rest of life on Earth as well. And the hope lies with people like yourselves. This is a big shift we're seeing, and an extremely welcome one towards citizens journalism, where we are seeing people who are prepared to speak truth to power. And none of the billionaires' concierges are ever going to do that. Of course not, because it's power that they're working for. And so what we're seeing is this great flowering. So we've got the Bylines network and Byline Times, which I think are slightly different, aren't they? Though connected, I'm not quite sure how you can. I'm sure you can explain. There's Open Democracy, there's Double Down News, there's Novara, there's Declassified, there's DSmog, to give just a few examples. And then the real flowering for me is at the local level. And I know you operate the Bylines network at the local level and doing amazing stuff, but we also see outlets like the Bristol Cable, Glasgow Bell, Belfast View Digital, the Mill in Manchester, the Leicester Gazette, West Country Voices, Birmingham's Dispatch, the Oxford Clarion, Hastings Independent, Waltham Forest Echo, Inside Croydon, Sheffield Tribune, Liverpool Post. There's loads I'm missing out here. These are just a few of these amazing new outlets, and they're doing all the brave stuff that journalism should be done with a fraction of should be doing, but with a fraction of the resources.
Since you mentioned about the oligarchs and the role they play via the media and then towards the climate, let's think about the COPs that is happening, or they are happening, and I can't see much change on them. So if I think about the COP30 that just happened in Brazil, it happened in Belém, that has the lowest GDPs per capita among the Brazilian capitals. They have high levels of inequality and infrastructure limitations, and they are vulnerable to extreme weather. So that is a dichotomy in that COP per se. So a place that hasn't received any benefits of the climate promises.
Yeah.
And so how come it can happen in a country that the majority of its electricity, that is about 88%, comes from renewables and biofuels. And even so, the government considers the phase out of fossil fuel as just, in capital letters here, just a possible talk of discussion. No endorsement whatsoever. So what is your opinion on the COPs?
Sure. So look, I'm not blaming the hosts of the process, whoever they might be, because it's a process that is screwed. And the process is screwed by design. In 1994, largely under pressure from Saudi Arabia, the UNFCCC decided that COP was going to be run by consensus. What that means is that you can have every other nation in the world agreeing to something and one nation can block it. Because unless every single nation signs up to it, it's not going to happen. And this is a disaster. It was designed as a disaster. It was designed to fail. And it's just staggering to me that so little effort has been made to change this system. So, one definition of madness is doing the same thing again and again and expecting different results. We've had 30 of these meetings now. Here we are. And there are many better ways of doing it. There's some very sophisticated decision-making pathways that you could use, like the modified border count, to give just one example. Or you can start with like a coalition of the willing, people who want to make this change, which then expands in a treaty-making process, a bit like what happened with the Anti-Personnel Mines Treaty or the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. You start with a small core, you build it out until it becomes a global norm, and then it pretty well becomes, a global decision has been made. You could have done that. There are so many ways, but instead, let's just sit here, have a massive fight every year and get absolutely nowhere because the process is broken. And until you fix that process, nothing is going to improve. And the world's people might be crying out for this change, but we're not going to get it. And so, if I were running the UNFCCC, and thank goodness I'm not, but if I were, I would say, right, tear this whole thing up and start all over again.
You've been fighting the good fight on people versus the system of capital, or people power, participatory democracy and ecology and environment for decades. Has the site of that fight, has the targets of that fight changed considerably? And I'm in the time then, and I'm thinking, there was a time when there were hope for COPs. You really would have thought this is an opportunity. How have those sites changed, and particularly what bearing has the rise of the populist right around the world had on that? Because it does feel like we're in a different place to where we might, if we'd had this conversation 20 years ago, it might have been slightly different, perhaps. So yeah, where do you think things are focused now?
So the first thing to say is I don't think it's changed that much, and conservatism and the far right are not nearly as far apart as many people imagine. We've always had these strands of thought which says there are some people whose lives are valuable and there's the great majority whose lives are not, and we can sacrifice the lives of the great majority for the sake of the minority, and the minority being those with economic power. And so that fundamental formula has been there throughout. And it doesn't matter whether you've got a Republican government, a Democratic government in the US, New Labour and Conservatives were a little bit different, perhaps, not that much. Current iteration of Labour and the Conservatives, Labour under Starmer is on many issues to the right of where the Conservatives were under David Cameron. So we've got a political establishment which says, we are going to listen assiduously to what the rich tell us and demand of us. And we might sometimes listen to other people, especially, in the weeks before an election, but most of the time their voices count for nothing. And so people are largely unheard. They know they're unheard, and they get really, really pissed off about that. And they say, right, to hell with all of you, a pox on all your houses. We'll go and vote for some lunatic instead, because at least he'll kick the system over. Of course, they don't. Trump and Farage never kick the system over. What they do is they reinforce certain aspects of that system and make things even worse. But you can understand the urge. There's a very fundamental law of how human beings behave. We have a powerful urge to destroy that from which we are excluded. And if we feel excluded from the political system, we want to smash it up. It makes us furious. We want to see them all go down in flames because it's just like, this was meant to work for me. It doesn't work for me. You're not listening to me. It's got nothing for me here. Just go to hell, a whole lot of you. This is a very fundamental urge. And, what we've seen now is decade after decade in which people are not being heard. So the rise of the radical right, the rise of the far right is a direct response to that, and a direct response to the ever wider capture of wealth and resources by a tiny economic elite. And so that's a further exclusion of the great majority of the world's people. And this is a fundamental thing that we've been up against throughout the climate negotiations, throughout all the issues that you and I are interested in. Is this basic concentration of economic and political power in the hands of a very few, who regard the rest of us with complete contempt as instruments, as tools when we're useful, and as people to be discarded when we're not. And then that great majority rightly feeling excluded and marginalized. And then, instead, in some cases, instead of going to figures who can actually change it, and sometimes we do that, like with the election of Zoran Mamdani, for example, with the great support that Zach Polanski in this country is getting with the Green Party. Sometimes people will get behind someone who could actually change it, or sometimes they get behind someone who just presents themselves as antithetical to the system they hate, but in many cases are actually a representation of that system with bells on.
Yeah. I've had exactly that same discussion with some of our people earlier this week, and that kind of almost fear off the back of that because Zach Polanski is pulling in the other direction, but with in the way you talked about, that actually that could under our current electoral system, this is a debate for another time, possibly even contribute to the election of reform with that 30% of the vote in some places. But another topic. So just to kind of close us then, I think. And it follows really well from what you just said. You said the answer was one word repeated 3 times when we had our event of the week: mobilize, 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 which a number of our people have been saying to each other ever since. And it was great on that event to see people starting to mobilize and connect and organize on the chat. It was really, really inspiring, actually. So I suppose 2 parts of this question to finish with. One is, can you really describe what that mobilizing looks like, what you think it might mean for people? And I suppose for you, what's next on the Monbiot agenda? If you would, what's the thing you are doing and that we should be doing really now to address some of these questions? Because even with all the great logic and thought and thinking and the kind of empowering way in which you articulate the story behind all of this stuff on a chat like this, it can still feel like, wow, where do I go as one individual sitting in this town, this city, this house right now?
Well, you put your finger on it just now, because you don't go anywhere as one individual. That is where if that's what you want to do, you're going to go wrong. It's only by combining with other people and building these movements that we become powerful. By ourselves, we're powerless. As consumers, we're powerless. It's only as active citizens, and what a citizen means is someone who's connected to other people, is part of a group, part of the civis. And only by becoming part of that civis, by engaging, by connecting, by building these networks, building these movements, can you express power. Now, people say, "Oh, I don't want to sit in the street." Totally, I get that. It's getting harder and harder. The laws against it are just horrendous now, and you have to be very brave. And the people who do it are remarkable heroes. But there's a million things which need to be done. For every person sitting in the street, you need 100 people supporting them doing other stuff. You need the radical lawyers, you need the radical administrators, the radical bookkeepers and accountants, you need the radical teachers, you need the radical bricklayers. It's like everyone has got skills, and it's a question of directing those skills into places in which we can change the world. And maybe your skill is in building social homes, for example, or creating communities. And these are essential skills, but maybe your skill is in representing protesters in court. Another essential skill. Maybe your skill is in organizing deep canvassing operations. Perhaps you're just really good at getting people mobilized or standing in the street with a flip chart, whatever it might be. There's so many aspects of this revolution which need to be staffed, which need people in there, sometimes in a professional capacity, very often in a voluntary capacity, but bringing their professional skills to bear upon that question. All successful politics is an ecosystem. We need all these different skills brought together. Now, and there's no one way to do it. There's no one place it's going to come from. Every time we think, oh, there is no hope, someone comes from a completely unexpected place and surprises us. You know, not long ago, it was a 15-year-old schoolgirl sitting outside the Swedish Parliament and created a wave that roared across the world.
Brilliant. Oh, thank you, George. All right, so we have to, Patrick, we have to be 15-year-old schoolgirls writing journalism with citizens. That's what we have to do. What a brilliant conversation. Thank you. And thank you.
Thanks very much, Ben. Real pleasure. Muito obrigado, Pachi.
Obrigada a você. Ótima conversa.
Okay.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Bye. Take care then.
See you later.
Thank you very much for listening to that episode of Byline Network Reports. If you wish to contribute to our cause, we have a crowdfunding page to help the network expand. Donate only if you can, and whatever you can. Every little really helps. We've also relaunched the Bylines Network Gazette, which you can sign up to from our website. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you in the next main episode, coming soon.